The headline point is that we gather here at the beginning of 2011, as it were, philosophical but disappointed by the review. I think in general there was a sense of disappointment. There was a long lead time in the thinking. I mean, 2 years of thinking about the review that's forthcoming and then some pretty good thinking that went on during the review. I don't think any of us would criticise the quality or the honesty of the thinking that went into it. But in the end, there were a series of relatively hasty decisions on the back of that quite long-term thinking. So we had, good, honest thinking followed by some pretty hasty decisions. There was honesty about the structural spending problem that was faced. It was clear after 2005 that there was a structural spending problem in the MOD, and it was clear that the 2007 round was unsustainable, couldn't be delivered. The 2007 round did not make sense. That was clear. But for political reasons that we don't need to go into, there was a hiatus. So we all knew that a review was desperately needed, but it didn't happen. So there was 2 years of as it were, self-aware, unsustainable budgetary pressures which would have to be dealt with. And then that was overtaken in 2008 by the financial crisis. And so the financial crisis was the overarching economic circumstance that was over and above the structural problem that Defence had clearly recognised that it had. Then again, the national security strategy was a perfectly good example of an attempt to think clearly about a national strategy from the top down at the cabinet level. What did it mean for all other areas of government? And we spoke about that a great deal in this institute. And the NSS is not at all bad. As an intellectual exercise, it was a pretty good intellectual exercise. And it was the basis for the SDSR. But it was some disappointment to those of us in the analysis business that in the end, the NSS and the SDSR had to be kept apart, albeit by 24 hours, and even if you put them together on the day, they still wouldn't have added up very well. They didn't really mesh together as well as we had hoped that they would, because of the circumstances in which the thing was carried out. And so we end up with a series of decisions which give us, the phrase that I've used is a somewhat eccentric force structure. A series of four structural decisions, which we know why they have been taken, but it leaves us with the public headline is, carriers with no aircraft, or producing 2 carriers, but we're only going to have 1 carrier. We're getting rid of maritime reconnaissance. What does that mean for the safety of our deterrent? What does that mean for expeditionary operations, and so on? And the idea is that these eccentricities will have worked themselves out by 2020, and by 2020, the force will look more coherent than it appears to at the moment. That's the trend of thinking. Well, we'll see. I think those have been the overall headlines. Let me be a bit more detailed about what I think the pros and cons are of this. What are the pros? What do I think we can put good ticks in the boxes, or ticks in the good boxes, over in relation to the Defence Review? First of all, as I've said, I think it was informed by honest long-term thinking. It went on for a long time. I don't think any of us were aware in this building of people trying to cover up or people trying to avoid difficult decisions. Very often officials didn't want to say too much because it wasn't their place to say it, or because decisions genuinely were still in the mix. And that's understandable. But I think there was a lot of honesty, more honesty in the Ministry of Defence than I often detect in other departments of government that I have acquaintances with. And I think that people should get some credit for that. Second point is that the process is continuous. We're now on a rolling review process. There'll be another review in 2015. And there is a sense that with the National Security Strategy as the keystone document that will be kept up to date, as will the National Risk Register, that thing brings the review process onto a continuing basis. Now, that's not without its difficulties, and there's pros and cons about whether you should have a quadrennial defence review in effect, or in our case, a quinquennial defence review. There are problems. But the fact that the process is continuous, I think it may not be that good for the morale of officials who are constantly being reviewed. But it does mean that we're now going to think in review terms before it becomes an overwhelming necessity. In the past, we've had reviews when it was a once-in-a-generation thing that we really couldn't avoid. And so the continuous nature of the process, I think, is probably a good thing. I think, thirdly, there's a pro in the sense that there have been good lessons in NSC-centric policy. It wasn't as smooth as it might have been, but nevertheless it was a lot better than it could have been. The idea that the NSC was at the centre of the process, the National Security Council, that the National Security Strategy was the keystone document, that was accepted throughout Whitehall. And if the process had longer to be worked through, I think it would have been a much smoother integration. But nevertheless, that is the way it will be for the future. And I think this defence review was at least 60% successful in creating a top-down version of a review. I think fourth point, the review pointed to cyber and information operations as something that we have to take on board. So there are new areas that the review has identified for which some resources have been put in, probably not enough, but nevertheless the process has been started. And I think that what the review is trying to do is to maintain as much as possible of the balanced force structure, that is the force structure that gives us as many options as possible in air, ground and maritime, so that in 2020 perhaps other decisions can be made. This review has not taken hugely dramatic decisions to end one role and reinforce another, not deliberately. What it has tried to do is to keep alive as many options as possible for the time when perhaps less pressurised decisions can be made sometime between 2015 and 2020. I mean, all that seems to me to be on the plus side of the review. On the downside, the con side, of course, I think we're all aware that a lot of force decisions were driven by spending, and in that respect, the review hasn't done enough. We know that what has been saved in the force decisions that have been taken is insufficient even to deliver that. PR11 is already a nightmare, no question. It is a nightmare. And our estimate, for what it's worth, is that the whole force is about £1 billion down in cash terms each year for the next 4 years. To get from now to 2015, it already needs about £1 billion more a year in cash terms, and possibly up to £2 billion a year. So it's already, as it were, unsustainable at this level. It hasn't done enough. If the object was to balance the books, they're not balanced. A second, I think, major con is, if you like, the strategy deficit. A lot of people have criticised strategy in this review, and of course it's all become part of political rhetoric. Where the review has done things people agreed with, they nodded and said, yes, that's sound. And where they disagreed with it, they said it's unstrategic. And what they mean by unstrategic is I don't agree with it. And what we've had is, again, it's no shortage of people trying to think strategically, but it's all taken place at different levels, without a particularly common vocabulary as to what we're talking about. The Green Paper of February last year, again, I think was a perfectly good exercise in trying to establish what is the context in which the UK now exists, as a postmodern society on the edge of Europe, in a physically rather safe part of the world, prosperous society but facing lots of challenges. That was a perfectly good exercise in thinking that through. But as a Green Paper from an outgoing government, it couldn't go much further. So in a sense, the strategy in the Green Paper was a certain amount of motherhood and apple pie, which it had to be. You have to do that. It didn't get you very far. And then at the other end, you had the Future Character of Conflict paper, the FCOT paper, which again was a very good piece of staff work, a very good piece of synthesis of military thinking about what future warfare might look like. But it was rather ground-centric, it was rather army-centric, not entirely, but it was at a slightly lower level than the grand strategic thinking that we need. So we had a Green Paper at a rather high level of abstraction, and an FCOT paper at a lower level of abstraction, and nothing really in between. And it seems to me that the strategic thinking was in a bit of a vacuum. It wasn't that people weren't doing it. It would be very unfair to say that the system was not trying to be strategic. It was, but not with a clear framework within which to be strategic, or clear enough, or with a clear enough understanding of what we mean by all of that. So what are the hangover issues then? What are the things that we take forward into 2011, 2012? Let me mention 4 or 5 of them very briefly, and I think these are the things that we'll come back to in this conference. It's the thing that our book, A Question of Security, is really all about. First of all, there's the major question of the force structure after 2015. This review is to take us up to 2015 with a series of things mortgaged to the future. But in 2015, on present plans, our calculation is that by 2015, the ground force element of British Armed Services will be 65%. In other words, 65% of the armed services will be ground forces. That's pretty high. The United States is 55%. France is about 55%. Germany will be below 65% when the all-volunteer force comes into operation. Countries like the Netherlands are of that order, 65%. Spain is of that order. In other words, after 2015, we will look like a continental ground power in the makeup of our forces when we are claiming to be an expeditionary capable power. Now, that's obviously driven by Afghanistan, which skews the figures. So after 2015, we'll be ground force heavy. Do we want to stay like that? Maybe we do, but that's a strategic decision. That's a pretty important strategic choice to make. If we don't, then reducing the ground forces by another 15 to 20,000 will have fairly big consequences, and that will necessitate a rebalancing of numbers between Army, Navy, Air Force. These ground forces, incidentally, are not all Army. We're talking here about, of course, the Marines and the RAF Regiment as well. But the force structure post-2015, post a change in Afghanistan, is a major future question. Second, of course, is the question of defence acquisition. The Green Paper will give us some pointers to where this is going when we get to analyse it properly. But again, there's a major structural change which I don't think we've fully taken into account here, which is that during the Cold War, when we prepared for war, it made sense to stretch out programs. It made sense to leave new acquisition as late as possible, because if you ever went into war, you wanted to go into war with equipment that was as modern as possible, not old equipment. So while the prospects of war were relatively distant, it was both convenient and sensible to stretch the programs out. Why bring in a new aircraft now if for another 3 or 4 years stretch it will be that much more modern just in case you need it in 15 or 18 years' time? So in a situation where we prepared for war, but war wasn't very likely, stretching our acquisition programs forward was sensible and convenient. But it's neither of those things now. Our acquisition program has got to produce material which is going to go into use almost certainly quite quickly, or has to be available to go into use quite quickly. And we live in the era of what the Americans now call hyper-competition between the major powers, not entirely military, but hyper-competition, in which all assets are deployed: information, cyber, energy, trade, currency, and that the great powers are engaging in what they call hyper-competition. And so the ways in which the military may contribute to those aspects have got to be rethought in terms of what we choose to acquire. If the military is to play a part in that agility of competitive relationships between the major powers, the big players, then we have to think about what that means for our equipment. That's a major question, major series of issues which we'll have to think about as we go forward. Third issue is the Defence Reform Unit, which of course is a matter of the way in which we organise for defence. And ultimately what we're trying to get at here is how to produce an efficient system, or a more efficient system, which deals with policy, with force generation, with operations. I mean, those are the three things we require from defence: policy, force generation, operations. That's it. Everything, to my mind, falls into one of those three areas. A fourth follow-on hangover is reserve studies. The reserves. We've tended to use the reserves as an auxiliary force rather than a reserve force. That may or may not be the right thing to do, but clearly they're not well structured for the way in which we have been using them. So both their numbers, their relationship to the regulars, and what we expect of them in the future is a matter of some importance, and that is being dealt with. And we look forward to seeing the results of that work in the first half of this year. And then finally, as a hangover issue, it is the political and economic context. And this comes down to some pretty dramatic questions. One is, will the situation in Afghanistan in 2015, whatever it is, will it allow Britain to draw down the combat role? Or, even if it doesn't, will we choose to draw that combat role down? Will we say we've done enough? Unless we do that, then quite a lot of other decisions which have been made in the SDSR will start to slip sideways. Even if £1 billion a year extra is found between now and 2014-2015, the defence budget will have to be uplifted by up to 2% after 2015 in order to meet the force structure for 2020. So we're looking at economic recovery which delivers something like a 2% increase every year, year on year, after 2015. So that's got to be decided in 2014, and the military have got to know about that by 2012 if they're to make sensible decisions. It's no good sort of holding them in the, well, maybe, maybe not, and then saying in 2015, OK, here it is. So the decisions, in a sense, are already very close. If there is to be sustainability, 2% after 2015, a decision in 2014, the MOD have got to know that by about 2012, that is the likely outcome. Now, maybe it won't be 2%, maybe it'll be somewhere between 1 or 2%. But nevertheless, if the Force 2020 is to be delivered, then a greater increase in defence expenditure than we have seen since the end of the Cold War would have to be enacted. Will the economy sustain it? Or, to put it another way, will the country and the government be prepared to make that much of a special case for defence? We don't know. That's the other great hangover question. And my final point, very, very briefly, before I hand over at 9:50 to James, is the question of strategic thinking. I said before that there's no lack of willingness to want to think strategically, but there does seem to be a problem of vocabulary. In a military sense, strategy is somewhere below policy. The politicians make policy, and the military therefore makes strategy in order then to give effect to operational and tactical decisions. That's absolutely fine. And what the military mean by strategy is ends, ways and means. We've also got to divorce that from the fact that what has passed for strategy in the last few years has tended to be business strategy, about efficiency, about running the organisation in an efficient manner. That's fine too, but that's not strategy in the way we think of it. But into that division where there is policy at the political level and then strategy at the military level, we have to put something above that, which is confusing because the phrases are confusing, of grand strategy, if you like, national orientation. And that national orientation, some of us have been having some discussions on that with analytical and political groups. And if you think about, what's fundamental to national orientation, what are the grand strategic questions, the Churchillian questions that the United States, which the United Kingdom has got to face? And I think there are three of them, and it's not quite clear where the political direction comes out of these things. One is that if anything is basic to Britain, the first national orientation must be that we want to maintain our prosperity in a globalised world and independence of action. That's fine. That seems to me to be a fairly bedrock requirement. So does that require our commitment in a military sense around the globe? That's a political question. You can argue it either way. Second bedrock national orientation is that, of course, we have a huge interest in stability in Europe, particularly in that part of Central and Western Europe that really matters to us. That's basic. So yes, we have that, but does that also, therefore, when you get one level down to the political direction, does that mean a continental commitment of the sort we have had since 1945? Possibly not, since we are now withdrawing our forces from Germany, and that's one of the things the SDSR has done. How do we think about our commitment to continental security now? We have a commitment, but to what extent is it to be focused on the military as opposed to some of the other instruments of government? And thirdly, finally, our United States relationship. If it is basic that it makes sense for the United Kingdom to be as close to the United States as it can practically be, is that a matter of maintaining the Atlantic Alliance? Is that because we need to be a transatlantic bridge? Or are there wider strategic interests that we might share with the United States in the Gulf, in the India-China relationship, in other parts of the world over energy security and so on? If we say, yes, we must stick to the US, does that also mean that we ought to work hard to be a transatlantic bridge? Maybe that bridge doesn't bear much weight these days. Maybe that bridge is not so important. So if we have a national orientation which says we want prosperity and independence of action, we want European stability, and we want to have a close relationship with the United States, those seem to me to be perfectly sensible, grand strategic positions to take. The policy questions that fall out of those are not immediately obvious. They were 30 or 40 years ago, they were even 15 years ago. They're not now immediately obvious. And so all of those things have to be addressed. At the very least, we need to agree a vocabulary for discussing those things. We all discuss them, but we don't discuss them against a particularly common vocabulary. And I think RUSI would be a fairly good place to start on that vocabulary. And some of the work that we've done and some of the things that we've written is our attempt to do that. So those are my preliminary thoughts on the SDSR process. They've tried to reflect the things that we've talked about in this institute and what, as a group of colleagues and researchers, we've worried about over the last year or so.